Welcome into the next section of the course. In this video, we go over the basics of spanning tree. Now, if you've not ever dealt with LANs before, you may be asking yourself, what is spanning tree? What does it do? How does it work? Well, the basic purpose of spanning tree is to prevent loops in an Ethernet LAN. And I know you might be thinking, loops on my network? Well, I don't have any loops on my network. I go to great pains to make sure that my cables don't plug into the same switch, and so I don't have any loops on my network. Well, in most modern networks, you have redundant links for use in case of a hardware failure. And I've got a little diagram on the next slide deck that shows how you might have a loop in your network. If spanning tree didn't exist, packets would just forward around the network in a never-ending loop. And the first thing people always ask me when I make that statement is, well, the time to live on the packet will eventually expire and it'll die off. At which point I remind them, time to live is a layer 3 construct. This is a layer 2 construct, and so long as it has a path out of a switch, it will go out that path. Spanning tree is there to prevent that. Now, in a normal network, the spanning tree protocol just works, but for optimal operation, you need to tune some of the spanning tree parameters. That is to say, if you have a network right now that has more than 2 switches in it, then you are running spanning tree, whether you know it or not, because every modern switch, at least every modern Cisco switch, implements spanning tree. And again, if you've got a small network with 3 switches and 50 users, you really don't have to put much thought into it. But when you start designing data centers and you have parts of your network that are layer 2 and parts that are layer 3, you have to take into account how spanning tree works, and you have to design it just like you do with any aspect of your network, or you could get some suboptimal results. When we talk about spanning tree in detail, we'll talk about what some of those suboptimal results might be. Now, spanning tree, when it is properly operating, solves several problems in a redundant switch network. The first is broadcast storms. Again, if you've got several switches that are connected to one another, and you put a broadcast packet on one of those switches, it will just keep forwarding around and around and around the network because there's always another path out of the switch that it's currently in. And a lot of this will become clearer on the next slide when I have my little small network diagram. The next is multiple frame transmission or receipt. If you have a loop in your network and you're not running spanning tree, then a workstation could potentially get multiple copies of the same frame, causing multiple instances of that frame being acted on. You're tying up resources on the sending host, you're tying up resources on the receiving host. Of course, the receiving host is going to reply to both packets because it may not get them at exactly the same time, and the problem is just kind of self-perpetuating. And lastly is MAC table instability. Now, you'll recall from when we talked about switches that the switch keeps a MAC table where it knows what hosts are connected to which switch ports. If there is a loop in the network, then any hosts that are not local to that switch will be seen as coming from multiple upstream switch ports. Here's this diagram that I've been talking about, and this makes this concept a lot simpler. Let's say in our network we have 3 switches like so, and you'll notice the redundant link here between switch 2 and switch 3. Now, this redundant link is in place in case either of these links fail, the link between switch 1 and switch 3 or switch 1 and switch 2. For example, if this link here were to fail, then switch 1 could still get traffic to switch 2 by going through switch 3. And so now we will add 3 hosts to the network. We have John, Jade, and Rose, all connected to their own switch. It's a very small network, and we've got lots of money, so everybody gets their own switch. Now, let's say that John wants to send a packet over to Rose, for example. His workstation is connected to switch 1, and so switch 1 sends the packet out for Rose's workstation. However, since switch 1 knows about Rose's workstation both on this port and this port, because again, you've got this link and the MAC address is known on switch 2 on both of these ports, you essentially have a big loop set up. It sends it over to switch 3, which sends it to switch 2, which sends it back to switch 1. Switch 1 sends it back to switch 3 because it learned about Rose's workstation from both switch 3 and switch 2. And essentially you end up with a great big loop in the network like so. The traffic goes from switch 1 to switch 3 over to switch 2. Switch 2 says, well, I know about Rose's port both on here and going through switch 1, so it sends it back out to switch 1, which switch 1 says, hey, I know about Rose on this port. It just gets really confusing. A Ethernet loop is actually kind of fun to look at in Wireshark, but it's a pain in the backside to get rid of because you basically have to turn everything off to kill off that traffic. What Spanning Tree essentially does is it turns off one of these links. And so if John wants to get this message to Rose, it has to go through switch 2 because this link over here is disabled, or in the parlance of Spanning Tree, that port is blocked. And like with all of our other concepts and all of our other topics, we go more into depth in future slide decks, and of course we fire up the lab and we actually lab it out so that you see it in production. But for the time being, this concludes our discussion of Spanning Tree basics.